Hi, I'm going to be reading you guys a conversation that I had with somebody in a comment section of a video I posted on my YouTube channel. The name of the video is Nations by Consent, Decomposing the Nation State, and this was me reading a paper that was written by Murray Rothbard. And Murray Rothbard, I'll take this from the Mises Wiki, wikimises.org, was an economist, scholar, intellectual, and polymath who made major contributions in economics, political philosophy, that is libertarianism in particular, economic history, and legal theory. He developed and extended the Austrian School of Economics based on earlier pioneering work by Ludwig von Mises. So he's one of the preeminent Austrian school scholars, economists, and theorists, and he talked about and mentioned and discussed this about many things. I came to know about Rothbard through many different ways that I'm not necessarily going to discuss into this one, but my current sociopolitical point of view or ideology is most closely defined by saying I would be an anarcho-capitalist. Now let me break down these terms because words should mean what they mean when you use them. But one thing I've often realized is when I'm talking to people, I don't think that they think what I think they mean. So let me explain to you what I mean when I say anarchism, when I say capitalism, and that might lead to why I think this is an important video or why this video might be valuable to you, because we're discussing the term of anarcho-communism that to me has always been so perplexing. And in this conversation I have that I'm going to read you guys here, along with another conversation I have in a separate video with the same person that I'm probably going to release as a separate kind of presentation, helped me kind of understand what somebody means or explains or expresses or intends to mean by saying anarcho-communism. So back to what I was talking about. Anarchism to me is just simply a situation when there is no ruling class that is not subject to the laws that they lead by. So it's not no laws. It's not chaos as some people define it as. Anarchism is simply saying we want an environment, we want a kind of society, we want a kind of culture, we want a kind of organization that is based on voluntary interactions. This is taking out the coercion, and the state itself is by definition an institution that has a monopoly of violence over a given area. They get to set the rules and laws in that place that are not established, that are not applicable to them. For example, if the state comes in and takes a certain percentage of what you earn and then redistributes that for a certain cause in that environment, you consider that taxation and part of the cost of living in a society. Now, if I decided to come into that same society and take that same amount of money from you and do that same thing without your consent, you can consider me a mobster, you can consider me a criminal, you can consider me a gangster, and take me to courts set up by that very state that does that same action that you are holding me legally responsible for, legally in the wrong for, and that state will then arrest me, put me in jail in some cases, and that's what I'm saying. There's a difference there. And then if you think this is a positive thing, little aside, if you think that's a positive thing and you're going to take that percent of your money and do spend it on that thing, why bring the middleman in it? Why let me be the middleman or let the state be the middleman, especially if me or the state are taking out a cut and then that person who you think is going to need that thing that you think will going to benefit from you spending that percent of your life ends up getting less. So there is something in there. Now, when I speak about capitalism, I simply mean an economic system that is characterized by the private or corporate ownership of capital goods by investments that are determined by private decision and the prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. This is from the Mises Wiki. I'm taking that directly because with this one, I don't disagree with anything written here, and it finishes off by saying modern capitalism is essentially mass production for the needs of the masses. Now, if you think there's something wrong in that, go ahead. If you add something to this, I do not consider that in the basic definition of capitalism when I am using the term. So when I say anarcho-capitalism, I simply mean a system where the society itself is governed by a system of laws not based on coercion. The interactions between the people are not based on coercion. People are allowed to choose. And then when it comes to the actual economic system, how people trade and relate with each other and exchange things, it's based on the acceptance and valuation as the ultimate thing to be private ownership. You accept and recognize private ownership and let people own and choose what to do with that private ownership and exchange it in that way. Now, I'll also go here to the Mises Wiki and explain to you why it's just difficult for me to understand how anarcho-communism is a thing. Because right here in the definition of communism that's listed here, that I also agree with, is communism is a political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production. For example, mines, mills, and factories, and the natural resources of a society. Communism is thus a form of socialism, a higher and more advanced form, according to its advocates. Exactly how communism differs from socialism has long been a matter of debate, but the distinction rests largely, and I'm laughing a bit here because you'll see when I get to the reading, which I'm just going to get to right after this, that we end up coming to this point and just the questions like, what's going on? This is the definition. Okay, so the distinction rests largely on the communist adherence to the revolutionary socialism of Karl Marx. So let me ask you to begin with, before we get into it, do you disagree with what I've laid out of the definition of anarchism, capitalism, or communism? When you use those terms, do you use them in these ways that I said, or do you have different definitions of them? Keep that in mind, because this conversation I had with Timbo was just it was a bit frustrating, but I'm just going to start getting into the reading now. I'll try to read the things. I've gone through and checked it through, and there's some different typos and things like that, and it's conversational. Sometimes when I'm writing these responses, I'm not keeping the grammar correct. There's different things I'm writing different ways, so I might make little adjustments, but I will leave a link below, especially if you are listening to this on the blog Rantathon that I have. There should be links below to the actual video so you can actually go through and see. And if you want to double check, don't just take my word for it. Double check and see that I'm not just completely reconstruing or rewriting the history that was actually written in the actual text of this. So getting into it now, here we go. I was considering doing an accent. I checked Timbo's account and he's posted some videos of him being in different like train yards and things like that on Australia. I think he's Australian because they seem to be from Australia. And I don't know if I have an Australian accent. I can't do an Australian accent. I have to actually study a Crocodile Dundee. That's not a knife. This is a knife. I don't know what the guy sounds like. So I'll just do it. I guess there's a chance I could go and okay, I'll test out and see if I can do in post-production and do the change of his actual voice and the cadence and the tone of things. I'll test it out, but I might not do it. I'm going to read and I'm going to say, this is him, then I'll read what he said, then go into mine. I might give some commentary in the middle of these things. Okay, so his first response was this. You should do a video on Mises, his acolytes, and democracy. Rothbard says voting is not a right, and we'd be better off to dissolve centralized power and let local organizations be controlled by an oligarchy. I have read of Mises's praise for Italian fascism as a stopgap measure that, quote, saved civilization, unquote. Jeff Deist from the Mises Institute says here, and he gave me a link, which is a link to a video where Jeff Deist, I think he is one of the managers of the Mises Institute right now, and he's giving a speech. It's posted by Philosophy Insights, Jeff Deist and the single greatest economic myth. There will be a link below, as I said, to this actual post, so you can actually get these links and watch them for yourself. But getting back to Timbo's comment, he was saying that Jeff Deist of the Mises Institute says in the link that I just mentioned, that democracy doesn't work. Is Mises's position free markets but not democracy? Rothbard's outlook on nations and capitalism without states begs a question about the use of state power to defend capitalism. Quote, collective self-defense, unquote, by the United States is the ideological cover for its wars of aggression. The tension between a democratic republic and its empire has always been a challenge for U.S. capitalism. Okay, that's it for the initial comment, and as you can see, there's already terms like capitalism being turned out, or adding U.S. capitalism. What does that mean? U.S. private ownership of things? How is U.S. private ownership of capital goods different from, let's say, Kenyan ownership of private goods, or Brazilian ownership of private goods, or Korean, South Korean, or things like that? What would the difference be? In the pure sense, you can say you either own them or you don't. But in the actual practical sense of how things work in the political world that we live in, You can lead towards a system where it's decentralized, where you have private ownership, people can decide what to do with the things that they own, or more towards the public ownership side where it's centralized and things come from that center and they decide what everyone does with those things. So now into my response to his comment. Yeah, voting is more of a bribe in many locations. For sure, it isn't a, quote, natural, unquote, right, since the state already violates your autonomy. Take this for example. Fast food in and of itself is not considered part of a regular, healthy diet. The chain Five Guys, however, has better burgers, which is fast food, than McDonald's, which is another chain of fast food. Here I'll paraphrase a quote from Walter Block that he had while debating Nick Gillespie. If you are a slave, and you have a choice between a slave master that whips you daily versus one that whips you weekly, and you vote for the latter, it is not a vote in support of slavery. End of quote. Then to finish off, I was talking about how these videos are attracting decent numbers over time, so I shall do more readings, and this is up to 270 views, which is pretty decent for my channel, so you can add to that, you can go there and watch it. And I'm talking about these videos because I'm also referring to that other video that I was discussing with him, and I'll leave a link to that. And in that one, I was reading an excerpt from the book Leninism and Contemporary Problems of the Transition from Capitalism to Socialism, which was written by Konstantin Ivanovich Zarodov. Now, I tried to look up information about this Konstantin person. I couldn't find an actual wiki page. And was he disappeared? I mean, I found this book. He wrote this book. It's actually out there. And I've seen some different things. I think it's the same guy who was the former editor-in-chief of the World Marxist Review. And some of these things, some of these histories are kind of taken away. But hey, I don't think it's even the situation of some kind of conspiracy. This is just, we're living in a different time when history was different. History is finally actually history. We actually have the ability to actually get history. If this Constantine guy was alive now, we'd be able to look back. Now you're going to have people 100 years from now looking at people and be like, wow, this person, look at this person's Facebook page, this person's Instagram, and that person was also somebody who's a leader of this revolutionary movement. It's kind of interesting how to see times have changed. Another thing on the names mentioned here, Walter Block is also an economist, an Austrian economist, and he writes a lot of papers, does a lot of research. Really cool guy. I remember actually meeting Walter Block at the Soho Theater. This is when I was living in New York. It was my great privilege to actually meet the anarcho-capitalist community. Some of the people in the ANCAP community there, I still keep in touch with some of the people, end up going to the Soho Theater to see these debates that they have. This was when they were starting. I actually went to the first couple of them and things like that. I remember Walter Block was coming. I'd heard of him through the Mises Institute things. I was like, oh, Walter Block is here. That's cool. And I actually walked into the bathroom, and then Walter Block was in the bathroom at the time. He turned around and was like, oh, it's Walter Block. Hey, that's the first time you meet this guy in the bathroom. It's a kind of interesting. I mean, for somebody that was somewhat starstruck over, was just yeah, this guy's really cool. It'd be really cool to meet him. Really like the way the guy thinks. He's done a lot of good things. And then, hey, here he is in the bathroom as his first meeting. But that's the kind of things you see in some places in New York. Right now, there's a focus in New York with the current pandemic. But it is some kind of central place for a lot of things going on. You just the random people you walk by in the street in certain places. And Nick Gillespie is the creator or something, or head editor at Reason.com. He's also a well-known libertarian, and they were having this debate over should libertarians support Donald Trump. There's also, that video is also online, and all the other debates, you can check that out as well. And that's a long interlude between these comments. I'll try to keep them shorter than that from here on. Now, getting back into the comments, now this is Timbo coming back to what I said, replying back. Dying alive. While I might agree on voting as a bribe, but for different reasons, and this in parentheses, the franchise was only extended to the general population when it was clear that they couldn't be excluded from politics. It's the end of the parentheses. But there seems to be something more here. Dice says that, quote, democracy doesn't work, unquote. Is, quote, democracy just defined as voting? Is it Mises' position to oppose all forms of voting? So what's he proposing? We have rights, private ownership of everything, the free market, and an enlightened oligarchy to manage the collective defense and legal system for disputes not settled by force. I'll be happy if you can recommend reading something or watching something rather than having to answer. And then he said he found what was after, and he sent me a link to a video of Hans Hermann Hoppe, who says what Marx gets right. This is another video from Mises Media, which is the actual YouTube page of the Mises Institute. I have separate videos talking about what the Mises Institute is. I have a video on my definition or my appreciation of the non-aggression principle, which is foundational to why I sociopolitically identify or think the closest definition of what my sociopolitical view is anarcho-capitalism, because it fits with the non-aggression principle. And in that video, I had this Hans Hermann Hoppe, which is Hoppe with the three H's, because Hans Hermann Hoppe is a well-known Austrian economist and theorist, and has a lot of discussions. And he has this thing about physical removal of communists and other malcontents. So it's a good talk. You should listen to all this content. When I'm having conversations like this, I prefer actually getting what the person thinks. If the person is providing certain sources, like I use the actual Mises Wiki to begin with, I use those because those are definitions that are somewhat concise, and they crystallize and condense what I would say about it to the word. There's not really things I disagree with there. So I'm not against sharing sources, just sometimes the sources people share are not quite specific, and you'll see that later on here. Now back to the responses. This is my response to his comment. Hoppe is a solid. Mises Weekend is also a regular listen for me, and I had heard that one before. I could stand to improve my recollection of things, but I'm still getting my mind back to the proper shape to deal with this quality of info. So what I was trying to get at here was, this is rather new. I mean, some of these concepts, there may be things that we actually have lived with. There may be things you can look in the rest of the animal kingdom and find actual things to understand about it, but they're relatively new. We haven't always used money. We haven't always had economies. We definitely haven't always had anywhere close to this idea of a global economy, of people exchanging these things. So ideas like socialism, communism, capitalism, democracy, republics, the systems that we live with, the militaries, all these things are relatively new in the sense that we actually live with and exist with today. Something like the non-aggression principle. Just saying you can actually have a system of morality, a system of organizing society, where you just say, yeah, we're just not going to initiate force. What kind of people? We are almost new humans. You look at the people in the past, and slavery was just a common thing, and that's going to come up here again as well. But we are technically new people. Some of these terms, you have to rethink things. They're not things that are just necessarily taught or trained. It's not a nurture thing. I think it's a nature thing, because part of what just makes me amazed with some of these things, reading Man, Economy, and State, just thinking about how clearly it maps out to just the nature that I see, is a rather amazing thing to me. But I'm also thinking, it took all that time to get to the situation where we have a society where people can actually think about these things and voice them in the way that they're done. I couldn't imagine some of these things being done, for example, in 1862, which was 100 years before Rothbard wrote Man, Economy, and State, let alone 1,000 years before. Did we even have a society or a culture where we had the comfort of somebody to actually come to that? And even when Rothbard wrote the book, with the accompanying Power and Market, he had to, at that time, release it in a certain way, word things in a certain way, and some of these topics, the society just wasn't amenable to it. You could actually die for even just thinking about certain of these things, or they would just be written off and thrown off without any acceptance. There still were very big, important parts of society that were still questioning if a human being had ownership over themselves physically. Like, you could literally own other people. That was still something where it's like, yeah, these are subhuman. This person is not capable of actually being in private ownership of themselves and their own actions. And that is just a basis for some of these things. Anyway, so we keep going on these tangents because getting back into the reading. Timbo now responds to me. Dying alive. It's clear to me now that Mises uses, quote, socialism, unquote, as any capital S state intervention in the economy. This also allows the disconnection of the development of the modern capital S state from, quote, true capitalism, unquote, / anarcho-capitalism. Given some students of Mises are now officials of the Trump administration, these are not academic questions. I am not clear on Mises' view of the relationship of price and value. I was previously under the impression that he saw them as synonymous, but now I'm not sure. On the subjective theory of value, the presentations I've watched seem oversimplified. Whenever I've heard it described, I immediately think that the intentionality/will doesn't take place in a vacuum, and the market is fundamentally a social process. Finally, whereas Marx gives a definite explanation of why different and definite models of production, i.e., slavery, feudalism, capitalism, arose and replaced their predecessors, I can't see how Mises can do likewise. If the free market with private property is the most productive form of social organization, why hasn't it always dominated? Because of the quote power of the exploiters? So that's the end of this particular reply by Timbo, and there was already some things kind of raising some question marks, like the quote true capitalism. That's a qualification. What is true capitalism versus just capitalism? Anarcho-capitalism I can understand because anarcho itself adds the anarchism that is speaking to something else that goes together with capitalism. But what is true capitalism? What is that setting up? And then he has this appeal here. I think it's some kind of logical fallacy. It's not appeal to popularity necessarily, but it has something to do with time. I don't know if it's appeal to antiquity, where he's saying, oh, this has been going on for some long time, or appeal to tradition, we just do things because they do. I don't think that actually works, and I'll address that in my comments as you'll see coming up. Now let's get back to it. How do you define socialism/communism? I am by no means an expert on Mises, Austrian economics, or capitalism. I am more knowledgeable than average, but was only exposed to Mises a few years ago, and though I have a voracious appetite for information, I have nothing close to a scholastic understanding of it that may be capable of addressing your possibly very valid objections and queries. We do, however, share similar access to materials that may answer them. I have scheduled reading the intro and opening part of Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis that was written by Mises next week. It may hold many answers that you seek. A little aside here, I did not read it, but it is free from the Mises Institute, and I'm taking a note right now to actually get to that, probably do it in video form. Back to the response. Some ANCAPs are absolutists, some gradualists. I myself do not know what I'd do if given a button that would end all capital S states today and render them unable to reform. Now, as for modes of production, slavery is not one of them. It existed before those two things you included with it, and continued after feudalism, and arguably capitalism is playing a large part in eradicating it. Win-win transactions between willing parties continues to prove to be the most productive. As for long-term domination, slavery has been quasi-constant in human history. Why does it not dominate today? This is in parentheses. I don't consider being essentially tax livestock to be slavery per se. End of parentheses. English is certainly the most productive language for global trade, but it too has not always dominated. Is it your claim that there's been a sort of proto-socialism/communism that has dominated historically and would thus be the more productive system to pursue? Okay, so that was it for my response. A little thing on private ownership and capitalism. Private ownership has existed long before the term capitalism was coined, which is coined by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French individualist and socialist, more commonly referred to today as anarchist. I don't know how those things happen. How does that thing switch? It's not in the Communist Manifesto. It wasn't about Marx. So this was in the mid-19th century was when the actual term came by, and it was normally used as a pejorative. Pejorative. That word always gets me. It was used as a pejorative. And it still is. I mean, it's done so much good for people, but it still uses a pejorative. Okay, back to the response now by Timbo. There's a story of Mises listening to a discussion in the United States about progressive taxation scales. At some point, he loudly declares, "You're all socialists," and then leaves the meeting. Maybe it summed up his disdain very quickly, but such taxes are hardly socialistic. Does he say somewhere that the term needs to be more broadly defined? Also, this might be part of a legacy issue given that traditional socialism was seen as the primary threat in the 1930s. I've seen one thing that one of the Mises.org authors has recently written a book entitled Crony Capitalism. That's the end of that response by Timbo. And I think he's talking about crony capitalism in America, and this is a book by Hunter Lewis. But that term, crony capitalism, is something that's used mostly to describe the current economic system that exists in the United States of America. It's not necessarily an oligarchy, it's not necessarily fascism. I think it's more of like a corporatism type of situation where influence is purchased by ostensibly private entities, private individuals, and corporations. They go and they have access to this select group of politicians and lawmakers that make laws, and then they pay them, or through different influence schemes and things like that, create favorable regulations and laws to prevent competition for these corporations and individuals. So it's a sort of symbiotic relationship of just crony capitalism. Now on to my response. Timbo, I saw that. If I'm not mistaken, that was when Milton Friedman was recounting a meeting with Mises and a few others. So how do you define socialism/communism? As I said, I am of an understanding that some things go towards socialism and others towards capitalism. I disagree with this standard of pure capitalism or socialism that you allude to. Simple example is the level of regulation and licensing by the state in the United States of America is a socialist feature, not a capitalist one. Fiat currency is another. Any centralized redistribution of taxed monies is another. And this is in parentheses. Private charities redistribute centrally, but taxation is not a choice. Finish of the parentheses. I do not understand some of the things that you point out. You make the claim that people who came after Lenin, like Zaradov, are not true to socialism/communism, and they strayed from and left out part of its core gospel, and thus may not be the best examples to judge their ideology and system. Then here you point out that the same is done by people who came after Mises. I agree people differ and have different needs, wants, views, and as such will adjust things. I would not expect that we can have 30 people all speak English that can all be understood, but some would have more proper English grammatically. Some may have English that's influenced by other languages to a point where it switches to being better described as the other language being influenced by English. For example, Sheng, which is a mix of Swahili and English that's spoken here in Kenya. At no point are any of the Swahili words, quote, part of English, unquote. Even when melded together, the resulting language is the addition of, and it isn't actual English. And this is how I understand the claim of crony socialism, as features of socialism are added to the capitalist systems. Please offer your definition if you may, so I can better grasp how you appear to think the two systems may be able to coincide. That was the end of that. So that one was just talking about, like, Swahili is Hakuna Matata. Now, you can be having a conversation in English and then say Hakuna Matata, and that wouldn't be actually an English word. Like, you have Japanese and things like that. Like, there's some words where you speak in Japanese and they just add an English word. It's still technically part of the Japanese language, and somebody's saying something, they would say that in English. There isn't a Japanese equivalent of that, but that's an addition of a new word. You don't go and say, like, oh, no, that's actually part of Japanese now. No, it's an addition of something else. And that's kind of what I was trying to talk about in this situation. So on to Timbo's response. He says, dying alive, from, and this is a link that he sends me from the World Socialist website, and you can check that out for yourself. There's a lot of information out there. And this is a question on socialism and communism. And this is the extract that he posts here. Socialism is, by its very nature, international. Its establishment will require the overthrow of the capitalist state in at least the major imperialist centers by the working class and the establishment of genuine workers' states. A socialist society will be one that, as Marx explained, stands higher in its economic development than anything so far achieved under capitalism. Production and distribution will be carried out according to a rational plan, not the anarchic drive for profit. Communism will be achieved only when all the material conditions for inequality have been overcome through the development of science and technique, and when the state itself begins to, quote, wither away, unquote. As Trotsky explained in his brilliant work, The Revolution Betrayed, quote, capitalism prepared the conditions and forces for a social revolution. Technique, science, and the proletariat. The communist structure cannot, however, immediately replace a bourgeois society. The material and cultural inheritance from the past is wholly inadequate for that. ... Marx names the first stages of the new society, quote, the lowest stage of communism, unquote, in distinction from the highest, where together with the last phantoms of want, material inequality will disappear. In this sense, socialism and communism are frequently contrasted as the lower and higher states of the new society. Unquote. And that's the end of the extract that he gives me. This is my response to that. I appreciate your continued responses, but you are ignoring some central questions, so I may stop interacting. How do you define socialism and communism? It is as if I am asking you to define Italian cuisine, and you respond with an excerpt explaining how Italians consider their food to be superior to French cuisine, and that a healthy nutritional diet is desirable, and that advancements in farming and sharing of information have created an environment for the spread of Italian cuisines. That's the end of my comment there. And I hope you see it. I'm not just trying to be insulting to this person. I don't mind actually getting sources or resources to say this is what I mean. But when you have something that seemed rather nebulous here, what was he talking about? Is this an actual definition of socialism? And I also have some suspicions when you have to define something by also mentioning its counterpoint. Like I saw this one meme, it's like one of those NPC memes. It's like someone who's a fan. I want to vote for Joe Biden, and then somebody tells me, "Tell me why Joe Biden is worth voting for without mentioning Trump." And then the next screen is just like the angry NPC thing. Like if you have to define the counterpoint, I want a definition of socialism that doesn't involve mentioning capitalism. Just like when I mentioned communism at the start, the definition of communism that I think people should be meaning, at least when I say communism, that's what I mean. That did not involve mentioning capitalism. Now on to Timbo's response to me. Dying alive. The basic character of a socialist society will be a democratic and rational control of the economy on the basis of production for human need. Socialism is a transitional stage where the state power still exists. Communism signifies the culmination of a process with the withering away of the state. I'm not familiar with Zaradov. What the Stalinists rejected from Marxism was a necessity of the world socialist revolution. Instead, they claimed it was possible to build socialism in a single country. In contrast, Lenin, Trotsky, and genuine Marxists insisted that the fate of the Russian Revolution depended on the worker class taking power in one of the advanced capitalist countries. Then he added in a follow-up reply that it just registered that Zaradov was the author of the book you were reading from in the other video. I will listen again so I can be specific in my reply. So that's the end of those two replies. Some commentary on this. As you see here, it kind of goes into that no true Scotsman fallacy type of thing, where it's like, these guys aren't really the true kind of Marxists that I'm talking about. And hey, depends on how you actually define Marxism in this sense. But here again, I'm mentioning he was talking about that other video that I was reading from, that we were also having a conversation in, and I might do a reading of that. It's probably going to make some sense to do that since it's related and informs some of the back and forth that we're having here in this exchange. But with that Zaradov guy, he might have actually known Marx personally, could have been part of that. I tried to check for a Wikipedia page, couldn't find it. I will search again for more. But this is the thing that happens. In history, some people just kind of disappear because we just didn't have the information to actually see some of these people. But one thing that does happen is, for example, in religions, you have a situation where the Jesus character, the person of Jesus, theoretically did certain things, but then when you think of Christianity today, it was probably more shaped not by what Jesus did directly or said directly, but by something like what the Catholic Church has done. Then now, after the Catholic Church actually established what Christianity itself was, the actual core content of Christianity, and codified it and put it out there into the general world knowledge, world know-how, then they came to Protestantism, and there's all these different denominations and things where maybe what most people are talking about when they say socialism now is more akin to Protestantism, when you're talking about what the actual teachings of Jesus, not even biblical Jesus, but actual Jesus, if that was a person that existed, had said. So in this situation, Marx would be the Jesus character. Some of these people like Zaradov and other people are the people who are codifying it and putting it out there. Then that thing actually develops. And then now you have the actual people who are talking about we want socialism coming out of universities. And what they're talking about would be completely alien to someone like Marx. So back to the reading with my response. So Timbo, the communism you described differs how from anarchism? And worker class isn't an unchanging thing. Once you begin to engage as an entrepreneur, how do you supposedly stop being a worker? I get the arguments of having genetic predispositions. Negroes in general are more capable of certain athletics than Orientals. But does that mean that the top table tennis players in the world should all be from sub-Saharan African genetic stock? If communism requires redistribution, who and what will decide and do this? Again, the basic premise does not seem credible without an appeal to the supernatural, be it mystical or some sort of mech or artificial intelligence that those in the Zeitgeist movement refer to. I could have the best genetics in the world ever to be a successful table tennis player, but why should anyone, anywhere, be able to then force me to play this sport or teach it to others for the sake of some sort of collective good? Have you considered yourself a scientific socialist for a while? You seem familiar with it, and I often wonder how some beliefs and stances last after the level of scrutiny you seem to have already placed socialism under. So that's the end of this comment. Now, some things on here. I was talking about the Zeitgeist movement here. I mentioned before getting together with the Anarcho-Capitalist community in New York, and one of the people we met was somebody who was in the Zeitgeist movement, and he was trying to explain it. I was like, wow, we had this conversation with him. He was an older guy. I think he seemed to be in his 60s. I met him at different things. We went to like different philosophy meetups and things like that. He was a genuinely nice guy to talk to, but some of the things, trying to pin him down on some of these definitions, was kind of tough. He was a bit batty, but he might have looked at me and thought I was a bit batty on what we were saying and things like that. But above all, I enjoy having conversations with people, and he was willing to converse, just like Timbo was willing to converse here. So I was enjoying this. And the Scientific Socialist is something that he mentioned in the other thread, in the other video. And scientific socialism, I guess that's kind of like Christian Scientist or something. I don't know what it is. But anyway, back into Timbo's response. Dying alive. There is no meaningful difference between communism and anarchism. This was also clear in the conflict between Marx and Bakunin in the First International. There is a massive difference on how this goal will be achieved, and the view of socioeconomic development. Exactly how the division of labor and the distribution of goods is organized will have to be worked out, but an initial step would be to make basic necessities like food freely available. That said, the market and money won't disappear overnight. For examples of how democracy might work, we can look to the Paris Commune of 1871 as an inkling of how it might work. The tendency will be towards less and less compulsion than we have now, not more. The democratic character obviously implies that there will be differences on how things should be done. This link gives a more extensive answer, and this is again from the World Socialist website, and this is a question on socialism and communism. Again, you can check that out for yourself and read from it. And this is what he continues with. I have been following Marxism for some time. It is the only cogent explanation of history, economics, and politics I've found. But I had to wade through a lot of calumnies and false flags to get there. A study of history is crucial, and the, quote, scrutiny, unquote, is only resolved by patiently working through concrete history. The barbarity of the two world wars last century, particularly World War II, and the role of Stalinists in allowing it to happen, were crucial to my development. As Spinoza said, quote, not to laugh, not to weep, not to hate, but to understand, unquote. So that was the end. And ending with that Spinoza quote is an excellent quote. And for me, that's, as I said, part of why I continue this conversation and part of why I really value just making these videos and having these conversations with people, people deciding to come and listen to what I have to say and feel that they've gotten enough to actually impart on me some of their thoughts and some of their time and have these conversations. And I really enjoy it, and I hope you guys are enjoying and getting something out of me actually reading this out to you. Because again, with part of this, there's somebody who constantly comments on my Twitter, which is at Anuma Salis, which is at AGNUMASALIS, if you want to follow me there. He comments on some of my things, and I had a post about, my pinned post is a video that I talked about the non-aggression principle, and I made a video about that, and he asked me about what I think about anarcho-communism, and I sent him to this video, and I was like, look, just read this, because I had this back and forth with somebody who had gone into it, and some of my explanations into it, and I was like, yeah, I'd thought of actually recording this video for some time, so now here I'm at, because it's been requested by some of my followers. So let me know what you guys think about this. But yeah, it's about understanding, and it's about trying to get try to get more knowledge. For me, I haven't found a situation where there's inconvenient truths. There's some truths where ungainly truths where I don't know what to do with it yet, so I just kind of put it on a shelf, put it in a cubbyhole, store it somewhere, put it in a folder in my mind, and maybe put it on some kind of external drive to call back to it later. And then just like now, I had, oh, this information was there, and I can call back to it. And that's the difference of the time that we live in. We have access to all this information. I think we're passing the information age, and now we're into the age of understanding. We can truly understand the way things are. We understand the present, we get a better understanding of the history, and we put ourselves in a better position to understand anything that comes in the future. Okay, this is getting towards the end of this. Here's my response to Timbo. Horseshoe theory exists. Choice, however, and lack of coercion means essentially everything to me. We have agreement on the differences, and as communism prescribes socialism, which has proven to be oppressive and quite anti-life, I shall continue the path towards anarchism. You use terms like freely available, but things are not free. You may, however, mean abundant, and surely you will agree that capitalism has created surpluses and encouraged people to create and maintain means of trading said surpluses. You seem to be well-meaning and have not expressed any ill will to my person, but I cannot support the force required in socialism and the abdication of one's agency. I say let's break down this democracy to the individual level, and I don't see how just having a larger group of dictators called workers is somewhat more benevolent than having one dictator called a monarch. Actually, it may be easier to gain the monarch by understanding their specific peccadillos and desires. It also may be easier to avoid this monarch, and herein lies some of the fundamental nefarious nature of having omniscient gods of the monotheist religions. It's hard to explain history without slavery, superstition, lack of the germ theory, etc. This does not make any of those things desirable. I am finding many logical fallacies in your responses. Anarchism extends from individualism and communism from collectivism. The two cannot meet. Having said that, your replies have made me closer to being able to understand and grasp anarcho-communists who have been quite perplexing to me for some years. So that's the end of that comment. We've got 2 more comments to go, but just something small in here. Just that whole thing that people say, oh, this has been going on for so long. But they'll say, A has existed for this amount of time, so it makes me understand what B is. Yet they don't include the C to explain why B required A to exist. In some cases, that A that they're talking about that explains the B, that existence of A, could have been the thing limiting B itself from being better because you haven't provided that C, if that makes any sense. I don't know, that might not make any sense, but it's a better way to put it. In general, people can look back at the past and see some things they think were positive, and again, anybody who thinks the good old days were the good old days either doesn't have a definition of good that I would agree with, or just doesn't have a good idea of what history was. I mean, we already know that history was very manicured. The winner was telling all the history. It was his story. It wasn't actually history. It wasn't actually what was happening. Even if you are completely honest and you're not listening to the tailored stuff, how much of that actual information were you actually getting? Were you getting the actual full scope of what was going on? I don't think so. But for me, just one simple thing, just already, from just being born into the body that I was born in, for most of history, I would have been considered subhuman. Then when I was living in the locations where there was nobody else, no ability to leave that area, those areas were horribly backwards without the lack of technology, lack of communication. It was a garbage time to be alive. I have as many objections as most to the current year, but I still do think this is the best timeline. Okay. Back to the responses. We got 2 more, and then we're finishing this up. This is Timbo responding to me. Dying alive. The development of the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union has an objective foundation in the low productivity of labor and generalized want. The bureaucracy was needed to ration out what little there was. This is why socialism is only possible when the productivity has reached an advanced stage. The assertion of the Stalinists that they had achieved socialism was just propaganda of the bureaucracy to protect its interests. On the question of collectivism versus individualism, there is a difference between the need of the working class to overthrow capitalism and the future classless society where genuine human freedom as in the freedom of one is only guaranteed by the freedom of all, is attained. It is worth noting that Marx started out as a radical liberal Democrat who was opposed to the Prussian state. He was drawn reluctantly to economic questions as he realized they were the real foundation of the political system, not the ideas. This was the shift from Hegelian idealism to materialism. Capitalism certainly does produce surpluses, far, far more than any other system in history. However, they induce a crisis because they drive down the rate of profit. More specifically, this crisis occurs when new investment in plant and equipment, the driver of capitalist expansion, won't lift the rate of profit. We can see this today where corporations are hoarding cash and engaging in financial speculation to create paper profits. This is when it breaks down. Whatever the complexity and monumental difficulty of the transition to socialism, its necessity comes from this inevitable breakdown. And that's the end, and this was his last response. And I don't have much to say. There's some things he says here where it's like the idea is good, but I'm not getting the source. I'm not getting the how we get to this place. You still haven't really explained how this happens. I'm not getting the connections of where it happens. And here's my final response to him. Timbo, I may be done with the discourse. Not much is being gained. We have perhaps reached that point. When you claim that capitalism creates a surplus, then somehow it will stop being profitable by doing the very same thing it's done to create said surpluses. People save until it is possible to invest for future gain. It can be a gain that occurs in 100 years due to some sort of assurance that private property will be respected enough that it can be passed on to offspring and causes one to find that to be something important. A lack of investment is mostly an effect of socialist policies of regulation and uncertain future environments. For example, I would choose to invest 200 million in a factory that will take 5 years to be operational and then 10 to turn a profit. However, the government has green energy laws that change every 5 years and demands that I use public sector unions that have fluctuating minimum wages and terms. They manipulate the interest rates so I can't calculate expected cash flows, and this is not a failure of capitalism. I do not know if your obfuscation is intended, but the result of this conversation is as frustrating as if it was. So the breakdown again is not, I repeat, is not inevitable. I say you must make the case for how it is before continuing your advocation. You say something that has been creating the very environment to have that surplus somehow turns into a reduction of it. You speak of crises that are imagined. Saving and eschewing profit for 5 years may lead to a larger net gain 10 years later that can be sustained. It isn't a mystery how this happens. It's actually the introduction of socialist policies that destroys the continued positive returns of a capitalist system and encourages, no, demands the suppression and oppression of man. We are collections of individuals, not an individual collective. You make unsubstantiated claims about what need occur. Oddly enough, you are stating your individual preference to trump decisions of others, yet claiming that there is a need to make collective decisions for all. Here's a quote I offered from Murray Rothbard. Capitalism is the fullest expression of anarchism, and anarchism is the fullest expression of capitalism. Not only are they compatible, but you can't really have one without the other. True anarchism will be capitalism, and true capitalism will be anarchism. That is by Rothbard. You and I are using the same language, same combination of lines and curves, in similar arrangements on the same platform, about the same topic of economics and society, but we disagree on the nature of the fundamental topics. We view human nature, what being a human is, in a fundamentally different way. So that was it. That's the end of the interaction. Let me know what you guys thought about that. There's many things in here that are just, like I said, it's the fundamental issues that I seem to disagree. He seems to bring up some issues. He says he wants certain things, like, oh, we should have this situation where there's more freedom. But I'm like, you're also admitting that capitalism has led to more surplus. So why would we switch away from that? Why would we go to less of that in order to somehow maintain this surplus? These AIs and things like this society, this future society where there's this surplus or this ability to use technology, what is the system that has led to the most advancement in technology, if not the capitalist systems, if not people saying you can personally profit from this? And when it comes down to it, I think it comes to this profit thing. Profit is considered such a negative word in this sense, but profit is, you can profit in so many ways. Profit is a beautiful word to me. It doesn't necessarily have to be monetarily. And having monetary profits is not a negative thing. When it comes down to it, one of the most profitable things someone can do is be profitable to the most people in the world. Look at the most wealthy people in the world right now. We're talking Bill Gates, talking, Jeff Bezos. Some of these people have done things. We're talking Elon Musk. These people are doing amazing things. Elon Musk is, wow, there's this thing, it's just amazing to think of. I have this other video where I'm watching a live thing of the Falcon Heavy launch, and this is with the SpaceX company, and this is the company Elon Musk developed, where they fire these rockets that go out into space and land back on Earth, and they can be refurbished. And it was just amazing watching this thing live and seeing it just come back down. And just a little knowledge I know about the space age, the cost that it takes to do this. We can literally leave Earth. We can literally colonize the solar system and then the galaxy and just move on. It's just amazing things to think about. And this is finally, we're getting a situation where SpaceX on May 27th, I'm going to be watching that, might do another live stream of that and just do a live recording or whatnot. But it's an amazing thing. A private company is actually sending 2 astronauts into space, the first manned flight. I watched that one of this testing out the rockets. This was back in, I think, 2017 or something, 2018. And then I watched ones of them sending an unmanned capsule to the International Space Station and testing that out. Just like, wow. And now you're doing this and just dropping the cost because Elon Musk is allowed to profit and all the people in his company are allowed to profit from what he's doing. The amount of changes that he's going to do for the human race to drop the cost of actually going out into space. And there's these things, just imagine you go out into space and you actually get these rare earth materials that create all this technology that we use. You can get an actual ship out there and go out and grab an asteroid from space and bring it back with all that rare earth, and you just have like exponentially higher amount and drops the cost into things. Then you have that situation where every single person can literally have an iPhone because you have an asteroid size rock that has all the actual elements that are in that iPhone. There's just so many amazing things to actually think about that can be done this. When you let people profit, you see when it comes down to it, the people that have been the most profitable to the most people are the ones who maintain wealth, who gain wealth. So if you are trying to profit, if you are trying to profit yourself the most, be profitable to other people because people enjoy profit. If every time you are around somebody, you are a net loss to that person's well-being, they will stop being around you. Without the institution of the state being there to actually enforce the existence and continuation of things that are not providing for the general demand of the public in the best way, from the demand of the private individuals that exist out there, then that system would go away. Somebody else would come in and take that because that demand is going to remain. The demands are infinite, but sometimes you have situations where people limit the possible people that can provide for those demands. And without the state, you don't have that. Without this collectivist kind of idea, like, where are you going to get this? Where is the price calculation? How are you going to know what people want? Who's going to decide these things? So some of the questions that he was asking here, I thought the answers were there in the free market. Some of the questions I don't know the answers for, but I shouldn't think that somebody else actually knows those answers for me. Somebody else supposedly knows all the questions I will have tomorrow, let alone 10 years from now, let alone 100 years from now what my grandkids, if I have any, would want. There's no person that actually knows this. This religion, this religious idea of this is not factual. It's not based in reality. We need to step away from that. So I think one more thing before I get out. There's one thing that's a little, it's kind of annoying to me, just this whole term, the worker. What does the worker mean to you? Because people talk about workers like, oh, this is the working class, this is this worker. We need to take the actual interest of the worker. Oh, the working people are not being served by this. Oh, there's the whole like bourgeoisie. Like, what's this distinction? Are you saying entrepreneurs don't work? Have you tried to start a business on your own? Do you think most entrepreneurs don't work more than the average employee that they have? I personally know a few entrepreneurs that work very, very hard, that work as hard as anybody I know who's actually employed by someone else. And in some cases, the actual risks on those entrepreneurs are rather massive. Right now, the world is going through a pandemic, and there are some positives from this. As I mentioned, we are in the age of understanding, and we're seeing just the liberation of certain places that are more. We're seeing some places that are more collectivists, more towards the central planning, and then we're looking at other places like the United States where there's more private sector, where there's more decentralization, letting more competition, and then we're seeing how does the system work when there's all these regulations and laws and limitations and what can be done versus what happens when you free people to actually pursue these things. Companies that were previously creating certain things and had limitations where you have to create only this have been allowed to just open up. And because the actual public is demanding ventilators, for example, now you're going to switch to this. Was the offshoring of all this production to China and places like that part of some sort of capitalist system? Having cheap goods is not a negative thing. I think it does actually somehow elevate the actual life of people in other places to create certain things. But some of these systems are not necessarily capitalist, especially when you go to China and you have to actually do work with the Chinese Communist Party, which is probably the most perfect example of fascism that has occurred in the actual world. It's a garbage system. So even if you are working, even if it's a capitalist, mostly capitalist company working with there, it's a situation where you have to follow the laws and rules of the regulations of that place. There's issues involved with how much China is devaluing their currency. There's issues involved with the inflation that happens in the United States of America due to, for example, having the Federal Reserve mucking with the interest rates and sending false signals where the money's not worth as much as it was, people getting credit, people being backed in like too big to fail type things. Everything should be able to fail, and then that actual need will then be actually met by somebody who can do that thing better, but then the interests are in there. There's just a messed up system, so much frustration that just gets to me, and then I have conversations like this. So, do you have a better understanding of anarcho-communism after this? I will do a recording, probably will do a recording of that Mises thing that I mentioned in this comment section, and also that separate conversation I had, depending on how this goes. I might schedule it to do it in the next month or so. Not quite sure, not making any promises. But on the screen, as I was reading this, there was a speed drawing of Rothbard and Mises. This is from my series of Anyone But K, which is this thing I do on Che Guevara, because Che Guevara was this despotic, horrible human being from Cuba, and he somehow got popular, somehow got in these shirts, and I thought, hey, let me do a series of different people who are much better human beings than Che Guevara. Anyone, pretty much. Like 99% of the people that exist in the world are better to have on a shirt than Che Guevara. So I have a lot of people to put. But Mises and Rothbard are two good examples of that. You can get t-shirts in the merchandise store. There's links to that with this. There's also things you can get: sweaters, sweatshirts, tights, dresses, stickers, coasters, clocks, all sorts of things. Good stuff. And this is part of the capitalist thing. I want to profit. If you feel you've profited from this video, or if you feel I've taken time in your life, you can also help me profit by just liking, sharing, subscribing, or disliking and telling me why you think this is an idiotic thing. If you think there's things I missed or mischaracterized about anarcho-communism, let me know in the comment section as well. And hey, we might engage in a conversation that ends up being worthwhile enough for me to record and actually post as a video in its own. So that's it for now. Like, share, and subscribe one more time. Links below to the merchandise store if you're watching this on YouTube or BitChute. There's all links for that stuff. Links to my social media. What else am I missing? Links to PayPal for one-time donations. Hope you guys are doing well in this trying time for all of us. It's the age of understanding. This situation will pass. We will be better after this. This is a sort of Rosetta Stone of human understanding of the human society that we can look back to and refer to and get some understanding of how we're comparing different ways to do things, different ways to prepare, different ways to be better. Goodbye.